Hi, I'm Liz Smith, North Dakota Forest Service Forest Stewardship Program Manager, and welcome to the final installment of the Managing Mature Windbreak series, Part 4, Windbreak Renovation. In Part 1 of this series, we talked about the history of windbreak planting in North Dakota and current initiatives to restore these deteriorating but still highly valued forest resources. In Part 2, we've talked about what to look for and what information to collect when scouting a mature windbreak and some common issues you will likely encounter. In Part 3, we assess the windbreak's performance in comparison to its intended purpose and the goals of the windbreak owner, and considered the direction the windbreak performance will trend with no interventions. All of these videos, as well as the rest of the videos in the Forestry Friday series, are available on the North Dakota Forest Service website and the Forestry Friday YouTube channel. Windbreak renovation is not a prescription or a recipe with specific, repeatable measurements that ensure a consistent and perfect result every time. Windbreak renovation and renovation planning is an art based on solid scientific principles like the functional effects of height and density that we discussed in Part 2 of this series. There are a suite of management techniques or practices that can be used individually or together to meet the goals of restoring or modifying existing function, or increasing the health and vigor, and improving the longevity of a windbreak. Oftentimes, these steps need to be undertaken in phases and can't be done all at once. This is another reason why we advocate so loudly for annual scouting and maintenance. The cost of doing nothing, or the cost of ignoring the problem, is real. Remember, North Dakota's climate, soils, and topography are more conducive to a grass-dominated ecosystem, and the vast majority of our windbreak sites are planted in areas that would not historically support forest. If we don't show up on behalf of our windbreaks, North Dakota will win by forfeit. Often with minimal small annual inputs to ensure adequate resource allocation, a windbreak can remain functional for generations. But we can't go back in time and reinstall a poorly designed windbreak, do maintenance that was never done, and we can't prevent extreme events that damage our windbreak unexpectedly. So where do we begin if we are just beginning today? All that information that we gathered when we talked with the landowner about their goals for the windbreak, scouted it, gave it its performance checkup, plus all those pictures we took, those are all taken into account during the planning process. So making a windbreak renovation plan is about identifying and describing the current state and identifying practices that can be undertaken to move the windbreak from the current state to the desired future state. There are many useful keys and flowcharts available to aid in the process of making these decisions and developing this windbreak maintenance or renovation plan, including this one from the University of Nebraska Extension, which our own North Dakota windbreak renovation design keys are based on. Oftentimes you will see windbreak renovation practices listed in a kind of like order, from least intensive to most intensive, or from practices to use on a slightly better condition windbreak to a worse condition windbreak. I find that each individual windbreak I encounter often has multiple condition situations happening all at once, so it's rare that only one practice will apply. I also like to think about the pros and cons of each practice individually and together. Remember, there is quite a bit of art involved in renovation planning. So among the practices that might be considered, we have natural regeneration, which is managing the naturally occurring seedlings that develop within the understory of some windbreaks and using this to improve windbreak function. Young woody seedlings may be found in many windbreaks and can be managed to improve windbreak density. In North Dakota, there is a marked decline in natural regeneration as normal precipitation is reduced from 22 inches to 14 inches from east to west across the state. It also tends to occur more often in wide multi-row windbreaks and rarely occurs in narrow 3 to 5 row or single row plantings. Managing natural regeneration usually means thinning competing woody vegetation regrowth in the understory to desired spacings and controlling herbaceous weeds. Occasionally, it also involves removing some of the overstory to allow the canopy to open and allow more sunlight to reach the younger plants. The main complaint about natural regeneration is that it's kind of messy looking, since this will rarely be in rows. But if we look at the windbreak as a mini forest, natural regeneration can be gradually thinned and managed to maintain a uniform performing windbreak. Competing vegetation, especially aggressive sod-forming grasses, rob trees and shrubs of moisture and nutrients. Heavy sod is more likely to be found in low-density windbreaks, windbreaks with wide row spacing, windbreaks lacking weed barrier fabric, and those where the canopy is open. Sod release can be done using herbicides or cultivation, and either method must be undertaken carefully to avoid injuring trees. Multiple treatments or follow-up treatments like reseeding may be necessary, and be aware that especially with cultivation option, you may get a flush of thistle or other weeds. Planting trees and shrubs into open areas or gaps is important for future windbreak protection. We often think of this as being important during the establishment phase, but it actually should be done on a continuing basis as openings occur. Interplanting with new tree species will increase diversity and can complement the natural regeneration that is already occurring. In both cases, with interplanting or gap planting, the overall function of the windbreak can be maintained throughout the process. But in both cases, the new trees will be in competition for resources with the mature trees. Mulching, watering, and protection from wildlife are important for interplanting to be successful. And all of this can be quite labor intensive. Coppicing and pollarding are the removal of the top growth on deciduous trees and shrubs in order that the root systems can initiate healthy, vigorous sprouting, and is applicable to most deciduous shrubs and many deciduous trees. A wide variety of tools can be used to cut off the above-ground stems, including a sickle bar mower, hedge clipper, chainsaw, pull pruner, or the like. For most shrubs with healthy root systems, regrowth the first year will often reach 30 to 50% of the pre-cut height. In these photos, we see that the carigana was cut off at approximately 6 inches above ground level, and by the following spring, it had vigorously regrown. Pollarding is pretty much the same concept as coppicing, except it's done higher off the ground to maintain the single trunk. Because of this, it may not be a DIY project. Similar to coppicing, the advantage is that there are very fast results, but with pollarding, corrective pruning will be necessary to correct the multiple leaders that will result. Both practices require that the tree or shrub have a reasonably healthy root system. Tree rows with many gaps, evidence of disease, or trees exhibiting minimal annual growth for the past several years may not be suitable candidates for coppice or pollard renovation. In these situations, coppicing or pollarding, if used, will need to be supplemented with new plantings. In this photo, what we see is a row of hybrid poplar that the utility company cut off at about 6 foot above ground to prevent the deteriorating poplar branches from dropping onto the overhead lines. These poplar have vigorously resprouted new growth, and this windbreak landowner got a free, if not voluntary, windbreak renovation. Supplemental planting is simply starting a new windbreak next to the old windbreak. Since the steps to undertake this are pretty much the same as a new windbreak, Contractors like the local soil conservation district are locally and readily available. This technique certainly adds age diversity to a windbreak, can increase density, and can add species diversity if the site can support different species than are currently present and the windbreak owner can be convinced to try something new. Supplemental planting does increase the footprint of the windbreak, so space considerations such as proper setbacks and property lines can influence using this technique. Thinning and pruning can be used to reduce windbreak density, remove diseased trees or parts of trees, and reduce resource competition. It's often advantageous to plant a windbreak with close in-row and between-row spacing to speed canopy closure and suppress sod-forming grasses, and to gain a functional windbreak more quickly. On the flip side, closely planted windbreaks put the trees in competition for resources, which in North Dakota are probably already limiting for tree growth anyway. Overly dense field windbreaks can cause troublesome drifting, which can then impede spring fieldwork. Thinning a field windbreak can quickly restore its functional purpose of spreading snow over a field. It goes against our very nature to cut down or remove a young, healthy tree, but removing every other tree in a row can stimulate growth in the remaining trees and improve the overall health and longevity of the windbreak. When thinning is undertaken after the trees are slowing their growth or under severe stress, they may not be able to respond to their improved growing conditions. Thinning and pruning can be very labor intensive, and it can be difficult to find a contractor offering these services, especially in rural parts of North Dakota. Remove and replace is the most disruptive form of windbreak renovation. Partial row removal can maintain at least some of the function of the windbreak while adding age and species diversity without changing the footprint of the windbreak. Care must be taken to leave enough of the windbreak intact that the leaf rows are not subject to wind throw. This technique requires slow and careful operation of sometimes very large machinery to remove the trees that need to be removed and prepare the site for new trees without causing mechanical damage to the bark or root compaction of the trees that are left. As with interplanting, the new rows will be in competition with the mature trees for available resources. Complete removal and replacement, like row removal, is the most expensive and most disruptive of the renovation techniques. Essentially, we are making a clean slate and starting over from scratch, so the functionality of the windbreak is lost for at least 20 years. This method does not usually require careful machine operation and does allow for site preparation without worrying of damaging leaf trees. For a windbreak that is so far gone, this might be the only option. This option also allows us to redesign or relocate a windbreak. So there are lots of different ways to bring a windbreak from its existing state to its desired future state. And besides the condition of the windbreak as a whole and the condition of each different row and even partial rows within the windbreak system, we also have to consider the landowner's goals, their available resources, their abilities, and their opinions. The windbreak landowner is essential to the success of the windbreak renovation. As planners and advisors, we need to consider what experience they have had with past windbreak renovations, what resources do they have available, including friends, family, equipment, time, even financial resources. Are they open to our suggestions, or do they have a plan firmly in mind that they are fixed on? Limitations can be real or imagined. Think about that windbreak owner who insists on only planting conifers, or the one who absolutely will not consider giving up 2 acres of cropland. The bottom line is the top line and the point I made right at the beginning of this discussion. Windbreak renovation is not a prescription or a recipe with specific repeatable measurements that ensure a consistent result every time. Windbreak renovation is an art based on science. I'm going to walk you through my process, and then we'll look at a couple of real-life recent windbreak renovations. This farmstead is pretty much right in the middle of North Dakota, MLRA 53B, the central dark brown glaciated plains. The farm is on the south side of a gravel road and is bordered on the south and east by farm fields and on the west by a hay meadow and a slough. No one has lived on this farm full-time for about 20 years. They use the buildings for farm equipment storage, and there's a small apartment in the garage. The grandson is thinking about building a new house and moving to the farm full-time. So the future prospects of this windbreak are very important. I pulled the soil map before I go out because I do not like surprises. I thought I might run into an issue with that slough off to the west and the CTSG10 soils that are associated with that soil map unit. I was relieved to find when I was on site that there was nothing about the vegetation that would give evidence of a soil change at that exact spot on the map. Rather, my notes indicate that that area next to the windbreak was actually still on a side slope where the lowest part of the landscape was further to the west. Here are some of the scouting photos from the site visit. This site visit was done in early spring, just as the trees were beginning to leaf out. We see in the left-hand photo there that there's a partial remaining row of cottonwood that are in extremely poor condition. In the middle photo, way in the background, we can see that there's also a couple Siberian crab apples left of the very first row on the inside of the windbreak closest to the farmyard. The rest of the windbreak is made up of row after row after row of Siberian elm, with the outside farthest west row being a thick Caragana hedge thicket. Throughout the windbreak is a thick mat of smooth brome. When I was out on site, I noticed that the landowner had cut down quite a few of the dead cottonwood and had started a nice firewood pile. I also noticed that they were mowing as far into the windbreak as they could go until they got to places where there was too many downed material to be able to operate the lawnmower. I pulled up old aerial imagery from the late 1950s and found out that we were dealing with a 14-row windbreak that is now approximately 60 to 70 years old. So when I'm back in the office and I pull up the imagery and start thinking about the renovation plan, I always like to zoom out and take a look at what other factors are influencing wind movement through the farmyard. So in this case, the rest of the farm is on the north side of the road, and there are bins, shops, trees, and buildings that are influencing the way that wind moves through this particular farmyard. The farmyard that I've been asked to evaluate a windbreak renovation for has 3 driveways coming in from the north. So it's unlikely that the landowners would be interested in planting trees in this area, plus the compaction from decades and decades of large machinery moving in and out of that farmyard probably would not be very conducive to tree planting. This is also an active farming operation. So while that means that there might be some equipment available to assist with windbreak renovation practices, this also means that this landowner and their family are very, very busy during the growing season. I think about what will happen if we do nothing at all to this windbreak, but just let it continue on its course. I like to also think about what's going on the surrounding land. And in this case, it's in farm production or in a hay meadow. I use ArcPro and lay out all my measurements so I can think about things like setbacks and space availability and things like that. So this is the renovation plan that the landowner and I came up with. We agreed that continued removal of the cottonwood would be a good idea. We then thought about adding a supplemental row or gap planting on the inside or east side of the windbreak in the area that the Siberian crab are now missing. The bulk of the windbreak is made up of Siberian elm, and the landowner would like to try to do a sod release treatment followed by encouraging natural regeneration of Siberian elm and perhaps cottonwood. We also discussed adding supplemental rows to the west side to increase species diversity on this site. Here are a couple more examples of recent windbreak renovations. In the photo to the left, we can see where the red arrows are pointing that this row of hybrid poplar was severely damaged in a wind event, and the landowner cut down the fallen and broken trees. This landowner does not own the field to the north, but they do own the land to the west and to the south. This site is Conservation Tree and Shrub Group 2K, which is somewhat limiting due to wetness, pH, and salts. The windbreak included removal and replacement of some rows, as well as a supplemental planting to the west. For this windbreak, we can see from this photo, which is taken from the northwest looking southeast in the direction of the arrow, we can see that this windbreak is far below optimal density for a farmstead windbreak. The interior rows consisted of Siberian and American elm that were mostly dead from Dutch elm disease. Windbreak renovation included complete removal and replacement of the Siberian elm interior rows, supplemental rows of shrubs planted around the inside of the windbreak closest to the farmyard, and since they were there anyway and doing the work, they went ahead and installed a 10-row shrub orchard, also on the inside of the windbreak. This windbreak is a south-of-the-yard windbreak. South-of-the-yard windbreaks are usually made up of fewer rows and are less dense than windbreaks on the north and west side of the yard in North Dakota. This south side windbreak is made up of a mixed row of deteriorated Russian olive and green ash, and a mixed row of shrubs including chokecherry, honeysuckle, and American plum. In this case, the renovation plan called for complete removal of the Russian olive and green ash, replacement of that removal area with 2 new rows, and the landowner agreed that coppicing the mixed shrub row would be a good plan. And it was a good plan. The 2 new rows, as well as the coppice shrub row, are showing vigorous new growth in the first year after renovation. Here's the before picture for the slide I showed earlier for interplanting. This landowner had a relatively easy project ahead of them, just picking up some downed material to get in there and get that smooth brome under control and do some interplanting to improve the function of this windbreak. Here's another before and after picture of a different part of the windbreak on that same farm. Some downed material was removed to allow mowing and selective thinning and corrective pruning of standing trees. Sometimes access is the very best first step to windbreak management and renovation. This windbreak renovation is on the north side of a farmyard. The interior rows of the windbreak were American elm and Siberian elm, pretty much completely dead from Dutch elm disease, and of course a whole bunch of smooth brome. The renovation plan included complete removal and replacement of some interior rows, as well as adding supplemental rows on the north side to increase density. The results of this windbreak renovation are already beginning to show with the new interior rows and supplemental rows growing well in the 5 years since the renovation was undertaken. Thanks for joining us for this discussion of managing mature windbreaks. For more information about North Dakota's forests, please visit the North Dakota Forest Service website. And for more information about planting trees, managing native forests, or managing your mature windbreak, please don't hesitate to contact me directly. Thanks and have a great day.